Welcome to the second session in our two-day symposium relating to the exhibition Surrealism Beyond Borders. The exhibition sets out several goals, the most important of which is to reconsider the movement of surrealism. And one of our greatest efforts was to further consider the legacy of colonialism, the adoption of surrealism in anti-colonial efforts, and at the same time, the erasure and blind spots that have contributed to a predominantly Western European and white story of surrealism.
Matthew and I are honored to present our distinguished guests, Zita Nunez, Robin D.G. Kelley, and Fred Moten for this session. Today, we have a very special opportunity to hear them reflect on the landmark publication, Black, Brown, and Beige, Surrealist Writings from Africa and the Diaspora, which was published in 2009, co-edited by Franklin Rosemont and Robin D.G. Kelley, and which was the first anthology in English to acquaint readers with Black surrealists from around the world. Our session today will be moderated by Zita Nunez, a contributor to the book that accompanies our exhibition, Surrealism Beyond Borders. She is Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania and a Mellon Fellow at Price Lab for Digital Humanities. Professor Nunez teaches and conducts research in the areas of comparative African American, African diaspora literatures and cultures, literatures of the Americas, and literary theory. The author of Cannibal Democracy, Race and Representation in the Literature of the Americas, which was published in 2008, she is now completing a manuscript titled Racism in Translation. It's my pleasure, our pleasure, to welcome Zita Nunez.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here and to conduct this conversation about Black, Brown, and Beige with Robin Kelley and Fred Moten. I'm going to begin by introducing our speakers. So Robin D.G. Kelley is the Gary B. Nash Professor of U.S. History at UCLA. So he says that when he isn't trying to play the piano or explain what his middle initials stand for, he spends his spare time reading and writing books such as Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original, Africa Speaks, America Answers, Modern Jazz and Revolutionary Time, Your Mom is Dysfunctional, Fighting the Culture Wars in Urban America, and Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. In addition to co-editing with Franklin Rosemont, Black, Brown, and Beige, Surrealist Writings from Africa and the African Diaspora, he is currently completing two books, Black Bodies Swinging, An American Postmortem, and The Education of Ms. Grace Halsell, An Intimate History of the American Century. These are both forthcoming from Metropolitan Books. His essays have appeared in several publications, including The Nation, Monthly Review, New York Times, Black Renaissance, Renaissance Noir, and Boston Review, for which he also serves as a contributing editor. Fred Moten works in the departments of Performance Studies and Comparative Literature at New York University. He is the author of In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition, and The Universal Machine, Stolen Life, Black and Blur, which are all part of the series, part of a series titled Consent Not to Be a Single Being. His latest book, written with Stefano Harney, one of several that they have written together. The latest one is titled All Incomplete. Fred is also a poet and the author of numerous collections of poetry, including B. Jenkins, which was named in honor of his mother. This year, Fred is the M.H. Abrams Distinguished Visiting Professor at Cornell University. So as insufficient as they are, these introductions also don't convey the outsized role that each has played as friend, colleague, mentor, advocate, and inspiration for countless numbers of us. They are, in addition, wonderful conversationalists, and I'm thrilled to be moderating today's conversation. I'm sure if we were live in a room filled with people, there would be thunderous applause right now. So we're going to have to imagine it while I welcome Fred and Robin for today's conversation. So before we appear together on the same screen for our conversation, I'm going to give you sort of a quick sense of our agenda for the next hour and 20 minutes or so. And we'll begin with a slideshow of images from the exhibition by painters and writers who were also mentioned in Black, Brown, and Beige. There are a couple of additions to the slideshow, specifically 2 images of the front and back of a painting by Malangatana from Mozambique, which will probably come up later in the conversation. The music in the background of the slideshow is a selection from Duke Ellington's Black, Brown, and Beige. After the slideshow, which will last about 4 minutes or so, we'll have our conversation and leave some time at the end for questions. So welcome, Fred, Robin, and I'm really eager to have this conversation with you about Black, Brown, and Beige. And so I thought we'd start by asking you, Robin, like how you came to be involved in the collection, the history of the collection that you co-edited with Franklin Rosemont, and what was the impetus for it, the goals, what was the audience for that was envisioned for it?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for being here. It's always great to have conversations with my dear friend Fred and with you, Zita. That alone is worth it. The history of this book is interesting because I'm a latecomer to it, and let me just be clear. Franklin, and I would argue Penelope as well, because they were such close collaborators, were working on a project like this for a very long time. I mean, their home was like a library for the history of surrealism around the world. And so I'd met, I knew about Franklin and Penelope through my friend Paul Buell from back in the early 90s. Paul Buell had published some of their work in Radical America, and he was always like hipping me to what they're doing. And I had a different relationship to surrealism, which I'll talk about later. But so when I met Franklin, we started a robust correspondence probably about 1996. And in that, over time, he's like sending me all these documents. But this is back in the days before people sent PDFs. They sent paper, So I had stacks of paper. He knew I was writing a book on Thelonious Monk. He sent me images of Monk by surrealists. And he sent me these beautiful, elaborate letters with designs on the side and a lot of information. And by about 1998, he said, I'm working on this project, putting out a collection of documents, of materials from around the globe, Africa and the African diaspora, dealing with surrealism. And did you want to co-edit? So it was basically done. My contribution was pretty limited. I can say, one, I should say from the outset that I trusted Franklin and Penelope because of their background. I mean, I knew them as surrealists, but they were first and foremost political activists fighting for liberation. I mean, Franklin studied under St. Clair Drake at Roosevelt University. I mean, they were like involved with the IWW, SDS, all these different organizations. And so I knew the politics part was really important. And so he sent me a whole bunch of material and said, I'm trying to put this together. I made some suggestions. I mean, I take credit for a couple things. One, ensuring that Adrienne Kennedy, Henry Dumas, and Amiri Baraka were in the collection because they were really, really important figures. Even if they did not necessarily identify themselves as surrealists. And this is something we're going to get to later. The other thing that I did, I mean, I'm embarrassed by the fact that he insisted on incorporating some excerpts of my own writing in the book, though none of that writing would be identified as what we call surrealist, and what that means is something we have to discuss. Mm-hmm. But I did write an afterword that is an attempt at a kind of personal and collective history of movement and art that connects with what we think of as a surrealist movement. So that's really the genesis of the project and my relationship to it. Of course, there needs to be another edition with some revisions and changes and expansions, but I'm really proud of the text and being a part of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Robin, I wonder if Fred, you can sort of talk a little bit about like when you saw the collection for the first time and sort of your connection to it, your response to it.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Zita, for inviting me to be part of this. It's always a pleasure to hang out with y'all. It's funny. It's really almost like there's a prehistory of my involvement with that book, which I think came out in 2007, right? and it's really got something to do, I think, with the sort of transatlantic history of radical publishing, which obviously Rosemont is very bound up in because of the work he did, editing Charles Kerr. I have, all these, which for me, I always identified as an anarchist publisher, that they published work by folks in the Johnson Forest tendency, which included CLR James and Grace Lee and Raya Dunayevskaya and others, Glaberman, and so I think they even, if I'm not mistaken, there's this great book by Rudolph Rocker called Nationalism and Culture, and I want to say Charles H. Kerr did that too, but I'm not. That might not be true. But so part of it was just, on the one hand, being excited to see what it was that Rosemont was interested in collecting outside of those strict sort of boundaries of, that sort of radical, anarchist publishing. And then also just noticing, that Robin, anything Robin's connected with, is always going to be good, and interesting. So he's always right there in the place to be. But it reminded me of two other books that came out before then. One is a book called Refusal of the Shadow.
Refusal of the Shadow, Michael Richardson. Mm-hmm.
Which was published by Verso, which was, I think in 95 or 96, in a collection of, sort of Francophone Caribbean writing, I think primarily. And so being, sort of tantalized and trying to follow the thread, just realizing that sort of maybe initial introduction to Francophone Caribbean writing of that period that, usually foregrounds the work of Césaire, that it was part of this larger movement that wasn't just reducible to him, and that there were all these other folks, and particularly, women writers who were doing this amazing stuff, under the intensest sort of imperial duress, not only in the wake of, France's involvement in Haiti and in Martinique, but also U.S. imperialism, which was so deep and profound. So that these aesthetic movements were always also, political movements. And then there was another book, actually that Robin, the book with Sidney Lamel, Imagining Home, Culture, and what was it, Class, Culture, and Nationalism in the African Diaspora from like 94. So these books are all together for me. So in a way, I guess maybe I feel like I was pretty well prepared for Black, Brown, and Beige when it came out. And then, the connection that was made, by implication to Ellington was beautiful. And I just found stuff in there that was, there's one piece in particular that I just became totally obsessed with, which I'll try to talk about later. But yeah, that's sort of my history with the book. So.
Mm-hmm. So I want to jump in and also talk a little bit about my first encounter with the book. It was the book that I was waiting for, like when it came out. I was scheduled to teach a course in spring of 2010 on surrealism in the Caribbean, Latin America, and Africa. And like Fred, I consulted those same books, also Penelope Rosemont, Surrealist Women, which included the work of a number of Black surrealist women writers. And I found material, anthologies that hadn't been translated, and also material that was included in anthologies about negritude and Black literature, or comparative approaches to negritude writing, that would have an essay or an article. But what was really extraordinary for me about the collection, which came out a month before the class started so that I could immediately put everything that I wanted to teach on the syllabus, was the attention that was given to translation, the idea that there were all these materials that were not available to scholars because they had not been translated and were being put in conversation with one another through this collection. So, so for me, that was a really important contribution that this anthology was making, and also that there were essays and collections in it from Africa. That there was material from Africa which was not so easily available in the other collections, that anthologies that were available. Mm-hmm. So, in planning this conversation, I had proposed to each of you that you present us with a piece of writing, an image, or something that would help, that would provide a kind of touchstone for us to talk about what we mean or what we are talking about when we're talking about surrealism in the context of this conversation. So I'm going to ask Robin to begin with, and to talk about what is surrealism for you?
Okay, so do you want to show the slide first, or just talk about it? Because
you can talk and show the slide. Cue the slide whenever you're ready for it.
Okay. Well, let me say a few things first, and then I'll cue. Basically, I guess there's 2 slides. But hearing both of you speak reminded me that there's another side, another part of this. Because, part of what I was responding to was the specifics of like my role in the book. But actually, that period from 1996 until the book came out, it came out finally in 2009, actually. And sadly, Franklin died just before the book came out. So he saw it, I think, in, Penelope could correct me on this, but he saw it, the book, in galleys, and and he might have even seen a hard copy, but he passed very, very soon after that. But in that decade, I mean, it's amazing because Fred needs to take some credit for my thinking on some of this, because In the Break comes out like around the time that Freedom Dreams comes out. Freedom Dreams has this chapter on surrealism, which is in many ways an outgrowth of both my relationship to the Rosemonts, but especially my relationship to 2 people who I want to focus on, Jayne Cortez. Everything begins with Jayne Cortez. I just have to say that. Everything. I first heard her read at a bookstore in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Shaman Drum bookstore, in like 1993, and I was transfixed. I didn't understand. It's like I never heard poetry like that. Mm-hmm. And she never really identified herself as a surrealist, though she was identified as a surrealist. She didn't disavow it, but she didn't embrace it. She said, "Oh no, I'm in the school of Langston Hughes," mm-hmm. which I think is really deep. And then the other person, of course, was Ted Jones. But it was through my reading and engagement that I got the opportunity in 1999, 2000 to write the foreword to a new English language edition of Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, where a lot of the ideas were laid out there. But those ideas would not be there had it not been for people like Fred Moten, for the jazz study group I was a part of, for the whole exciting scene in New York City at the time, and especially for my relationship to Ted and to Jayne. So in a nutshell, if you could show the slide, I'm going to talk about Ted Jones. Okay, so Ted Jones was so much more than a teacher. He was a gift. He and his wife, Laura Corsilia, we got to know them in the late 90s, mid 90s really. And every time they were in New York, they'd come stay with us. at our apartment and stay for sometimes 2, 3 weeks, and just I would learn and listen. And Ted was always making art, you know, as Gloria was always making art as well. And so sometimes he'd make stuff there, sometimes he'd send stuff. And Ted, of course, for those who don't know, was, you know, one of the 3 major so-called Beat Generation poets, writers of that period, along, you know, maybe 4. He was also sort of anointed in some ways, although that's a bad term and something that I don't think he'd even identify with, by Andre Breton as like the first American Negro surrealist he'd ever met, which is a very funny story that Ted tells. But what I loved about Ted and Laura is that, you know, they were poor, they were struggling, they were traveling around the world, making art, living a life of freedom, and making work, but also being politically engaged. So at the beginning of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, Ted sent this to us. And it's, if you can't read it, it says, "Hey, Robin DG, this is my Teducated response to the feeble-minded turpitude of human slaughter." You'll see, you know, the flags of the U.S. and Afghanistan. You'll see rhinos. You know, Ted, like a lot of surrealists, but especially Ted, loved rhinos. He said that they were the most intelligent animals on the planet, and that includes humans. And they're the ones, their emancipatory, their abolitionist practice ram, you know, the sort of feeble-minded turpitude of human slaughter out of the way and create space for a truly free world. And, you know, he passed not, you know, a couple of years after that. And then the other piece I just want to show real quickly is a piece that he made while at my house. Should be on the second slide. And he you know, he would make work and give it to us. And I love this piece. He just found objects. He found this piece of wood in the trash somewhere and took, you know, letters and magazine covers and then sort of created this interesting collage. And if you see, he includes his most famous poem, the poem he always begins or ends his poetry readings with. He says, "If you should see a man walking down the street, talking aloud to himself, don't run in the opposite direction, but run toward him, for he is a poet. You have nothing to fear from the poet but the truth." And that is Teducation. Everything I know just about, and much of what I've written has been inspired by Ted, because in some ways he challenged the very idea of surrealism as a closed movement with members. For him, it was about what it meant to live as a Black person, what it meant to live as a free person, what it meant to live with where your ties are the whole world, and yet none of those ties are bounds, you know, or locks or handcuffs, you know. And so he lived freedom in a way. And I have all these recordings, and conversations with him, and with Ted, one last thing I should say, Ted and Laura both love the music. And my connection to so many people centers around this music, the music of Duke Ellington, the music of Thelonious Monk, the music that all of us end up being connected to. Because to me, whether you name it that or not, that is surrealist praxis. And Ted lived that, you know. So I honor him in thinking about that. And without Ted, I don't think I would have had the courage to even participate in a book like Black, Brown, and Beige.
So maybe we can come back to the conversation and remove the slide from the screen. Great. So Robin, you know, what I'm hearing from you is a sense of surrealism that, as you said, it's about a praxis. It's not about movement. It's about sort of networks and ways of being in the world. And did you feel like that was a sense that animated Black, Brown, and Beige? Did you feel what was it about the collection or the framing of the collection that both permitted you to, but also required you to argue for the inclusion of Jane Cortez, Henry Dumas, and Amiri Baraka?
Right. So Jane was already in it.
Mhm.
It was Baraka, it was Henry Dumas, and Adrian Kennedy.
Adrian Kennedy.
Yes. But then again, I mean, those are three.
Mhm.
We can all think of 3,000. And I think your question is so profound because, and I think Franklin and Penelope would probably agree, not everyone in that collection self-identified surrealist.
Mhm.
Some actually were part of surrealist groups in Egypt and Brazil and places like that. But many were creating work in which it was informed by or informed surrealist, organized surrealist practice. But the idea of organized surrealism is sort of it's a contradictory term. It's organizing around political struggles is one thing, but a movement that has an inside and outside, which is what some surrealist figures coming out of Europe believed, that there was an inside and outside, not everybody. So when you look at that collection, it is very idiosyncratic. It is, a lot of it has to do with who was around to be able to translate some of this material, what work even made it into print, because you think about if surrealism is a way of life, then much of the poetry of daily life will never make it in print, will never actually be captured. It's like the music. Like we have writing about music, but there's no music in that book, because you can't put it in a book in the same way. So if anything, the book I think was intended to be a kind of provocation and to open the doors. Black, Brown, and Beige, as a concerto, as Duke Ellington's masterpiece, was always meant to tell a broad-based story of Black people, right, around the world, in wars, in ending slavery, fighting for freedom. And that expansive revolutionary thrust was meant to open the doors, not just for Black people to be free, but for the globe, for the planet, And in many ways, that's what the text, I think, represents, these experimental, visionary projects, but just the tip of the iceberg. Because as we know, what we call surrealism predates the term itself, and will continue long after the term is forgotten, because it is about turning life into poetry, making poetry of everyday life, whatever form that might take, the way you walk, the way you talk, my daughter Eliza, who's like just a brilliant genius, reminded me of something that Fred said, and Fred said, it's more than once, a mess is a form of measure. It's a way. A mess is a way of measuring. I don't have in fact, Fred, you could correct me, but it's a unit of measure. And we know what that means. Like we have a whole language around, if you want a mess of greens or a mess of hog moss or a mess of tofu, you know what that means exactly. It's a precise term, and that language is part of the poetry of everyday life. It's not supposed to have some Latin roots. It has roots in life. And so that to me is the aspect of surrealist practice that we always have to return back to, because we could create 10 more books and it would never be able to capture that part of the art. And it never could be contained in a museum like the Met. As much as I like the Met, never could be contained, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, not at all. I mean, this is, I feel that Fred probably with his, he's going to have two pieces of music to share with us. We'll pick up on some of the themes and observations that you've made. So maybe we'll go to Fred, but I'd like to return to some of the points that you raised just now. Fred?
Okay. No, there's two other folks who I feel like whose names we should mention because of that period that you're talking about, Rob. Sort of after, between now, I guess, in 90, 95, 96, because Brent Edwards's book, The Practice of Diaspora, came out in 2003, and that also, like, I couldn't read this stuff without reading that. I had to learn how to read from Brent, and just learn the importance of these notions of translation and articulation that he works with in the book, and also Tracy Sharpley Whiting's work, on the women's surrealists. All of that is part of this general, ferment that we're here to represent, in a certain way. But as Robin says, and as Zita's been saying, this goes way, way back. This is this is about modes of, aesthetic, social existence that really have to do with, sort of people grounding together, as Walter Rodney says, and recognizing the sort of immense, strangeness and beauty, of things on the earth, and of trying to honor that even under conditions of duress, even under conditions of, and not only trying to honor it, but trying to live in a way that's not separate from it. So anyway, so I have some music to share. One is a piece, just a few, just maybe a minute of a great piece of music, I think, by George Clinton. It was, I think the album is from an album called R&B Skeletons in the Closet. And it was released in 1986. And this is, I actually think, is one of his greatest pieces of music, which is saying a lot since he made so many great pieces. And it's called Mixed Master Suite. So maybe just a minute of that, if it's okay. And I'll comment on it in a minute. The next piece, which is for me a kind of an extension and also at the same time a kind of deepening and enrichment of what George Clinton is doing, is by this wonderful Black British musician and film director and performer and writer named Klein, who I just came to find out about and to love her work over the last couple of years. She's produced many records, just a sort of active, hyper productive, creative person. And the pieces from her latest album, which is called Harmattan, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. It's referring to this extraordinary sort of, what's the word? I'm trying to think of the fancy word for weather, but it's a weather event that occurs in the Sahel, you know, in sort of Western Africa, a kind of amazing wind that sort of determines a certain kind of season in that region. Her family, at least part of her family, I think, is from Nigeria. But this is a piece of hers called Rock, and it's about 4 minutes. I think I'd like to just play the whole of it, and I hope you'll see. I don't even know if she was consciously, let's say, borrowing from Clinton. I prefer to think of it as not necessarily a conscious borrowing from Clinton, but rather an extension of a set of practices which don't originate with Clinton, but which were refined in a very specific way in his work. So here's that piece called Rock. As beautiful as it is, I'm scared I don't want to take up too much time. And I actually wrote out something to read, but I'm not going to read it because I feel like the juxtaposition of these pieces sort of says it all. But there's one paragraph from the book, from Black, Brown, and Beige, that I want to read. It's the opening paragraph of a small piece of writing called Preference, which was written and published in 1944. It's by Lucy Tessé, whose name I hope I'm not butchering too much, but it's to me, it's my favorite piece in the book. And I just want to read the first paragraph. She writes, an obsessive sound of steps behind the screen, an obsessive sound of steps inside the screen. The viewers shiver in the half light, an obsessive sound of steps before the screen. The obsessive steps descend into the entrails of the mute crowd, pressing in on the old wide lathed barricade displayed by the barely lit screen. The obscure ambiance chirps with inaudible tufted sounds while the obsessive step materializes further. Two long legs covered in gray wool crossed the full width of the screen and probably walked all around the barricade, for they wandered over among the crowd. The shadow hardening space is far too opaque to let them be counted. And the thing I'll try to say as briefly as I can is, in the discourse on the music of surrealism, a lot of the criticism is focused on the idea that what surrealism in music is a kind of deployment of what is variously called the devalued fragment, or the historically devalued fragment. The folks who love surrealism in music, as well as the folks who are wary of it and suspicious of it, like most famously Adorno, they agree that what surrealism has is a kind of montagic or collagic quality, even in music. It's a music of the mix, but it's a music in which old and supposedly dead fragments are brought back into the mix in a way that's supposed to give some indication of a truth that ordinarily would not be seen or heard. That sense of a kind of improvisational truth making within the context of collaborative study, in which the improvisation is really a practice of looking back, of a kind of critical retention and reconfiguration of what has already been given. That's very different from anything that one might call automatism, right? It's one of the I totally reckon, surrealist writers and surrealists and critics of surrealism always want to point out what they think of as this deep connection between surrealism and jazz around the notion of improvisation. What's less clear is whether or not they've really thought in a rigorous way about what improvisation actually is. Improvisation is etymologically understood to be connected with not looking ahead, with a kind of movement without foresight. But what if the movement without foresight is not because people were incapable of looking ahead or incapable of planning? What if it's because what they were always doing was looking back, right? It's this amazing combination of forward movement while looking back, right? And looking back in these deep, deep critical ways that then produces this amazing interplay between recursiveness on the one hand and constant interruption on the other. And that recursion and interruption, that's like the building blocks of George Clinton's Mixmaster Suite. It's the building block it's the building blocks of Klein's work. And it's also the building blocks of Tessé's writing there. The sort of beautiful repetition and variation on the phrase obsessive sound and step. And all this for me points to the ways in which it becomes useful and maybe even necessary for critics and historians to associate such work with the term surrealism, because surrealism raises certain terms that become useful in our outlook. But at the same time, it's also clear that the historical accounting and criticism of surrealism isn't nearly adequate to the kind of work that Klein is doing or Clinton is doing, or for that matter, Monk or Ellington or Ted Jones or Jane Cortez. So, it's a term that we use until we can, make ourselves capable of throwing it away. Anyway, I'll stop there. I know I went on too long. So,
could we have the group again, please? So I just want to respond right away by saying I'm so glad that this is being recorded, because as Fred speaks, there are like ideas that are sparked and connections that are made that require time and reflection, but are just exciting. So one of the some of what I heard coming back from both Robin and Fred is this sort of a response to this idea that's at the beginning of Black, Brown, and Beige in the introduction. The idea that and I'm quoting, the Surrealist movement began as a spontaneous association based on elective affinities. And that's what it has always been and still is. And there's a sense I'm getting on the part of a lot of painters and writers, thinkers, activists, who we would say name surrealist, who don't feel that this is an elective association, but a recruitment into a kind of category that is not sufficient to account for the ways of and the being Black in this world. So every example, if we're running out of time, so maybe in another context, my slide could come up. But the painters that I identified, has all of the fragments that Fred and Robin talked about, or maybe it would be possible just to put the slide up just for a minute. Not this one, the next one, please. Yeah. So, all of the way of being Black that, among other ways, is expressed through a surrealist language process, because this artist, a Brazilian artist, Otávia Araújo, is, formed through the classical tradition, comes to surrealism in the Soviet Union, where it is, adopted or embraced as a response to, the shackles of social realist art. But there is also the sense that that needs to be damaged in order to reveal what informs that, that art, that life, that the movement, and to have the Black gaze, show through these images, and also the revisiting the same fragments and putting them together in different ways, which makes me think, can we go back to the general, take the slide off and go back to the general view, which reminds me of like Wilson Harris's Infinite Rehearsal, or even like this idea of, the chaos, to like risk the chaos that Audre Lorde talks about, to have to keep coming back and back and back again, because the Black life, Black living, Black being is always, risking that chaos and reorganizing, risking the chaos, reorganizing. So of course, a framework like surrealism can never fully account for even as it is this really important language, it's just one of many. It seems to me that this is what I'm hearing from both of you. Yeah. Okay. Great. So I wanted to move on to one last question, which is to discuss in a focused way something that's been coming up through the conversation, which is about the category of surrealism. So is it useful for those of us who work from a Black studies perspective, and should our understanding of surrealism with a capital S or a small s, claim a place in institutions that have not had a history of informed presentations of Black artists and artists of color? If so, like, how can this happen? Since the inclusion model does not and has not, from my point of view, worked to address the exclusion of Black artists. Inclusion, it doesn't seem to be the answer here.
Who goes first? Does it matter? Okay, I'll jump in. No, I think you set up the question beautifully by talking about that work. And I just want to say two very quick things that are related directly to the question. One is, I'm so glad Fred mentioned Brent Hayes Edwards, because he not only wrote Practice of Diaspora, but he wrote a really brilliant essay in Transition on surrealism. And it hit me because one of the things that my biggest regret, I have many regrets about the book, but one of the big ones was the exclusion of Will Alexander, which I wasn't familiar with Will's work, but Brent brought it up, and he really hit me to Will's work. And I didn't realize that Franklin didn't include him for a reason. I didn't know any of this until after the fact. And in many ways, the question of framing of an exhibit or project around a category like surrealism is both about inclusion but exclusion. It's also about that. It's about who doesn't count. And if I had one sort of argument that I've been making consistently, going back to writing on Césaire, going back to Freedom Dreams, to my afterword, is that for Black artists, surrealism wasn't so much a movement they were recruited into and then it transformed their work. It was basically an act of recognition. It's not like joining the Communist Party. So there was a recognition that what they heard speak, what they saw practiced, was something they've been doing for centuries. And that act of recognition then forces us to rethink what are the artistic categories in which we group people, and what are the consequences of the price we pay when Will Alexander, who wrote books like Vertical Rainbow Climber, Above the Human Nerve Domain, I mean, beautiful, amazing texts, ends up producing work that is so powerful and expansive, but then somehow you can't find him in Black, Brown, and Beige, and I'm sure that goes the same for the visual art. But I'd love to hear what Fred.
Well, I'm just looking through the, I held up this book by Will. It's his latest book of poetry, and it's called Refractive Africa. And it's an extraordinary book. And one of it's a book in which he is really kind of focusing on and working through sort of, putting his own mind and voice through the sort of vocal and literary lenses of two other writers. So Amos Tutuola and Jean-Joseph, I never can pronounce his name right, but Rabir Avello, the great, the Malagasy writer, who's actually included, one short poem is included in Black, Brown, and Beige. And So even if Will's not in the book, the book is in Will, and he is in the book, in a certain kind of way. But what you're saying is right. I mean, there's anthologies. There's a great sort of scholar and philosopher of photography, Ariella Azoulay, and some of the work she has written on Israel. She and Adi Ophir, they coined this phrase, incorporative exclusion, right? And that's the logic by which anthologies, even great anthologies, work. They work by way of extraction and rejection. This is how this sort of logic of collection and equivalence, works. And so there's a real deep kind of interesting irony when it comes to this particular book, which is that it also works by way of this logic of exclusion and incorporation, or, rejection and extraction. But what it does that with is writing that in general seems deeply committed to the refusal of those logics,
Mm-hmm.
right? So in a way, it's like an anthology of the uncollectible, an anthology of a bunch of stuff that resists, collection. And instead of the sort of ordering logic of collection and valuation and categorization, this writing is really focused on, again, on the refusal of that. It just doesn't work that way. And so we have to not only, I think, blow up the term surrealism, we even have to blow this book up. We have to augment it. We have to, but it's great enough as a book that it invites that. It requires that. It'd be cool to have like to have a book like this where you put everything else in it yourself. It requires it could be remixed, and unbound in a way, So,
but taking that and thinking about, say, museums and exhibitions. I mean, this anthology was starting from a point of departure. I think, in your essay at the end, Robin, you say, you came to, I discovered surrealism buried under the rich black soil of Afro-diasporic culture. You came to Breton through Césaire, Perret through Richard Wright. I mean, there is a different, one is situated differently in a collection like this than in a general exhibition about surrealism. So how can that, how does one think about these types of exhibitions around broad categories in arts institutions that undertake work similar to Black, Brown, and Beige, or that aren't, where we aren't thinking about them in terms of what they include and what they exclude, but rethinking exhibitions in museums like the Met and others.
Right. No, I think Fred is absolutely right about blowing up and remixing, because what ends up happening is that as much as even the most radical curators try to do their best to break the canon, whatever the canon is still the framework, whatever the core is. And the core is almost always European when it comes to visual art, almost always. So imagine if you flip it. Because think about, there would be no surrealist, there would be no Paris Surrealist group or group in Brussels or any place in Europe without anti-colonial struggles in North Africa, without the colonial expositions which inspired people to think about African art and culture differently, without, Caribbean struggles, all those things in some ways are the center. So you'd have to flip it. You have to rethink where the center is, or even think about like how centers are created in the first place. So I think if we think of exhibition spaces as these living spaces that could be remixed constantly, to sort of take from Fred's ideas or language, that's required. It in some ways requires new curators, curating practice that comes out of outside of the museum, and I think one of the big disruptive acts, I think, was the exhibition of Ted Jones' incredible Exquisite Corpse, which was reproduced. And here I give credit to Macho Diawara. In fact, the film that's about, I don't want to talk too much about this, but the film that came out about the Exquisite Corpse shows that this is a work of art created over many, many years. David Hammonds, made the film and with Mancha, that came over many, many years, that represents a collective project of art making over a long period of time. There's nothing like it, in terms of the way museums operate. They're limited. They don't have, and this is the people's grassroots sort of creation of collective art. That as a practice itself could be a model for remaking the museum. Anyway, I'm gonna stop.
Okay, Fred?
Just very, very briefly, I think to pick up on the notion of an alternative model of curation, which might either renew, the museum or bring it to a close, but either way, we should go with that. And it would be a model of curation that I think would be very much tied to chance. And it just makes me think of one of the really cool things about the anthology. All throughout, these writers all over the world are focused on foregrounding the notion and the beauty of chance, particularly the writers from Tropique, the Francophone Caribbean, surrealists. Man, so many of them, that Stéphane, Jean Alexis, and Menil, they all talk about chance. Which in my mind, I want to think of in Du Boisian terms, the evident rhythm of human action, to the incalculable rhythm, of human action. And if there would be a way to curate, by chance,
Yes.
which would require openness and devotion to what you see, to whatever you see, outside of, beyond, that would be, determined by the principle that's lodged in Ellington's favorite compliment, which was beyond category. Right? To be open to what you see beyond the imperatives of category.
So we unfortunately have run out of time. Actually, there are questions. There'll be an opportunity to address some of the questions that have come up tomorrow in the closing sessions. So if you have questions, please submit them and we'll run them by Fred and Robin to be able to share them with you tomorrow afternoon. I want to thank you both for a really great conversation, and end with sort of I guess a kind of bibliography, I guess. Like there's Black, Brown, and Beige, but throughout this conversation, there have been references to other works, other scholars who have been critical for all of us in our thinking about surrealism. The Black, Brown, and Beige, Out of the Shadows has come up, surrealist women, journals and that have had special issues on surrealism, like Callaloo and Small Axe. There's D. Scott Miller's Afro Surreal Manifesto. And there's an issue this month on Egyptian surrealism. Unka, the magazine, the arts journal, has a special issue on Egyptian surrealism. And as should be clear from our conversation today, this is just the latest in a long series of conversations around Black surrealism, what it is, how to document it, where and when to explode the categories, when and where to find it useful in a movement towards freedom and creating different ways of being in relation to one another. So again, I thank you both, Fred and Robin, and thank the audience, and look forward to continuing this conversation.
Yes. Well, thank you, Zita. Thank you, Fred, as always. And and I hope everyone else enjoys the rest of the conference. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you, Z.
Thank you.